Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Shedding the Light on Solar. I'm Shireen Othman. I'm a communications specialist with LES. You may have noticed that your mics are muted, so we won't be able to hear you and your cameras are off. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can go ahead and use the chat box or raise your hand function and we'll answer them at the end. Joining us today is Marc and Jennifer Banger with our Energy Services Department, and they'll walk you through the process of installing solar panels and anything you need to do beforehand. So Marc and Jennifer, whenever you're ready, we can go ahead and get started.
Well, good afternoon to customers, to colleagues around the company, to trade allies that have joined us. Thank you for taking part of your day to talk a little bit about solar. We look forward to talking and sharing some information with you. I want to point out that today's webinar is a very basic high-level overview of solar and what to consider when you're looking at rooftop solar for your home or your business. But I also want to point out that today's conversation is also a response to some troubling activity that we've noticed that's been undertaken by a couple of firms in the past 18 months. And this includes using pressure sales practices and misrepresenting factual information. Investigating and investing in solar is a rather capital intensive and long-term financial commitment. And a decision of this nature requires trusted factual information. Make no mistake, there are some very reputable solar firms in town that have been doing a lot of work with customers over the years. But when there is an effort by a firm or two to get misinformation out there, it really can create a lot of confusion, and it can give customers pause as to whether or not they even want to pursue solar. So today's presentation is really focused on educating everybody about the facts and providing that information so that customers can make wise decisions as they look into this venture. So hopefully by the end of the webinar, you'll be a bit better informed if you choose to pursue solar, or if a solar company comes knocking on your door. So with that, I'm going to switch over to my presentation here. Bear with me as I go through the process of sharing my screen and then opening up the presentation. Bear with me one moment here. There we go. Okay, we should be able to see the full slide as we begin through this. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is net metering, just a basic overview so everybody understands what that is. Many of you probably do. It's a good refresher. We'll talk a little bit about solar in our community, a little bit of information about what has happened over the last 10 or 15 years in the solar space, in the customer-owned solar space. Then, rather than just present all this information, we're going to engage you in answering some questions to test your knowledge about solar. It'll provide a good opportunity for us to drill down on certain items that may cause confusion or that we've noticed that a couple of firms have been misrepresenting. And then Jennifer is going to talk to you a little bit about solar tools and resources that you can use that are readily available on our website, so that after today's presentation, you can continue to learn about solar and use the resources we've put on our website to help you make good decisions. And then, of course, we want to allow plenty of time for Q&A, which you can enter questions throughout the presentation in your chat. I know that Shireen is going to be monitoring the chat questions that come in, and then we will answer those questions at the end. So please don't be bashful in asking questions, and we look forward to addressing those after we complete our presentation. So let's start with a basic question: is what is net metering? Net metering. So here is an illustration of a fairly typical arrangement configuration. Obviously, a customer would have solar installed on their roof. We're going to talk a little bit about the best places to put that solar, the best directions that solar should be facing. But obviously, solar will peak its production every day at noon, assuming that it's a clear day, assuming that it's not a shaded solar array. You'll get your maximum production usually between noon and 1 o'clock. That electricity is created and converted from direct current to alternating current, so from DC to AC, in a component called an inverter. So every solar system would come with an inverter, and those are the two primary components of the solar system from an expense standpoint. Other than the installation piece, you've got the solar arrays, and you've got the inverter, which converts DC to AC. And then, of course, that electricity then is fed into the main panel of your home to serve circuits throughout your home. And then we have a special net meter that LES would install that is capable of measuring the energy that your home consumes from LES, but also what makes it different is that it also will measure excess energy that your solar produces. So there are times of the year, if you think about the shoulder months like we're in now, where you may not have heat or air conditioning running. And there may be times of the day in those shoulder months where you're actually producing more than your home consuming. So that energy, that electricity flows back through that meter and out onto the grid, and we record that as well. So what happens then is when you get your electric bill and you have a net metered system like this, we're able to track how much energy you consume from LES and how much excess energy you produced or energy that came back to LES, and then we net them up. And if your solar panels produced more in a billing period than was consumed, LES purchased that excess energy at about 3 cents a kilowatt hour, which is slightly incentivized. All the energy that your solar system produced up to the point of excess is valued at the full retail energy rate. So you're getting credit for all of that energy at the full credit of the full rate, around 6 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's how net metering works. If your system doesn't produce more than consumed, then you'll be charged that amount that LES provided that made up the difference. And that's really how net metering works. Let's talk a little bit about solar in our community and just some facts. First of all, a little historical review. 2006, LES was the first utility in the state to actually offer net metering. It wasn't enshrined into state law until 2008. And at that point, every utility in Nebraska had to interconnect to systems size 25 kilowatts or less, and it had to provide payment for excess energy at the avoided energy cost, and had to provide full retail energy credit for all the energy consumed up to the point of excess. In 2014, LES undertook a value of solar study to really dive deeply and understand what does solar do and how does it benefit the system. And at that time, the board approved some incentive rates that provided a one-time value of capacity payment that customers still can get to this day, $375 per kilowatt for southerly facing systems, $475 per kilowatt for westerly facing systems, as well as a slight incentive for excess energy produced by the solar system. We also set up a tiered system. So in 2017, we had a full megawatt of customer-owned solar installed in our service territory. And so the excess energy price that we paid was cut in half. And it's now at around 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour, but the capacity payment continues. And in 2018, we had 2 megawatts of solar installed, and the board approved the continuation of the 3 cent per kilowatt hour excess energy purchase, as well as our capacity payment. And that's where we're at right now, is in the middle of that second tier. This chart simply shows you the growth of solar over the years, from the time that we had our first system or two back in 2009, all the way up through last year, where we have had over 240 systems installed, most of those residential, but there are some small business in the systems in there as well. And you can see that we have grown pretty steadily through the last few years. Some other facts about solar in the community. Customers have invested more than $6 million since rooftop solar was first installed back in 2009. And LES, through its one-time capacity payment, has provided over $1 million towards incentives for customers. The average local price for solar last year was between $2,500 and $3,500 per kilowatt. And the average system size installed was 8 kilowatts. So if you do the math, you can see that in the $20,000 to $28,000 range was the average price that was paid for an 8 kilowatt system. That does not include the federal tax credit, nor does it include the typical or average one-time capacity payment, which would be about $3,000 for a southerly facing solar array. So you could perhaps take some of that off the top of that cost and kind of get an idea of what these systems are running, or at least what they were running last year. There is some inflation, of course, and so those costs may have gone up a little bit going into this year. And according to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, each kilowatt of unshaded southerly facing solar should produce between 1,400 to 1,500 kilowatt hours. That's just a range. These results can vary on a variety of factors, but obviously the biggest factor is the direction that the array is primarily facing, as well as whether there's any shade. Obviously the tilt angle can impact that a little bit as well. I believe 20 to 40 degrees tilt is optimal for our latitude. So we've gotten to the point now here in the presentation where we'd like to engage you and ask you some questions. And so I'm going to exit the presentation slides and get back into the MS Teams environment here. And I'm going to load up the questions. So we're going to ask a series of 10 questions. I'm going to ask the first 4. Jennifer's going to ask another 5, and then I'll wrap up with 1 question. We're going to open up the question, ask you to respond, and then we'll share back the results and talk a little bit about the question. So here we go with the first question. See if that is, there we go. The primary bill savings resulting from solar is a reduction in the energy charge portion of a customer's bill. Is that true or false? True or false? And hopefully that question is open on your screen, and you should be able to enter in your answer and hit the submit button. And now I should be able to share the results here. Can you see that, Shireen?
Yep, I was just going to say, if you participated, the results will show up in the chat box on the side, or it might still be on your main screen, just depending on how big your screen is.
Thank you, Shireen. 87% of you, as I view it, got that right. That is important to note, that the primary bill savings that results from solar or any renewable generation that you might interconnect, but it's primarily all solar, is a reduction in the energy component of your bill. You know, you have 2 components. There's a fixed customer and facility charge, and there's an energy component, which is dependent on how much energy you use every month. It's that component that's impacted by solar. Okay, so that question is completed. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer, and she's going to ask, no, I guess I'm going to continue to ask the questions, right? All right. So I will ask the next question here. According to the Energy Information Administration, retail energy rates in our region are forecasted to rise between 4 to 5% each year annually over the next 10 years. Is that a true or false projection by the EIA? 4 to 5% annually over each of the next 10 years. True or false? And it looks like we've gotten 57 responses, so most people should have responded. The actual answer is false. The EIA is projecting for our region of the country energy rates, the energy component, to raise between 1% and 2% each year over the next 10 years. The reason I bring this up is because we have seen marketing materials from solar firms that project rates rising 5% or more for each year for the next 10 years or longer. And of course, when you project rates going up that quickly, it makes the payback period look a lot shorter. The past is no guarantee of the future, but over the last decade, our energy rate has been increasing about a 1% per year. Obviously, we're a period of inflation, so that will likely pick up a little bit. But to suggest that energy rates, the electric energy rate, is going to increase by 4 or 5% each year for the next 10 years is really much out of line with what the Energy Information Administration is projecting. Move on to the next question here. To maximize solar production, rooftop solar should ideally face which direction? North, east, west, or south? Okay, responses coming in. All right, well, a vast majority of you got this correct. The correct answer was south. 73% of you selected south. There was a few that selected west. I want to point out that you should really never consider putting solar panels on the north side of your home because the sun does not really directly shine on that piece of the house. For those who aren't able to put southerly facing panels, there's about a 20% reduction in production output, reduction in the amount of energy produced annually when you put panels that face east or west. So you can do that. It's just that it won't produce as much energy, electricity as a southerly facing. So there are a lot of homes that aren't ideally suited for solar. On top of the direction the panels are facing, you obviously want to mitigate, if not eliminate, the shading and anything that's going to block the sun, because if the sun isn't shining on it, it's not producing energy. I know at night, maybe the moonlight might produce a little bit, but it certainly is going to be pretty minimal compared to a southerly facing or even a westerly facing array. So southerly is the ideal direction. And then I'll continue on here. The next question, and this was mentioned earlier in the presentation, the typical cost for rooftop solar, and that would not include the federal tax credit or incentives, just the gross cost of solar as of last year, and really currently this year, is what price range? $5,500 to $6,500 per kilowatt, $2,500 to $3,500 a kilowatt, $1,500 to $2,500 a kilowatt, or $6,500 to $7,500 a kilowatt. And it looks like quite a few people did pick up on the conversation we had earlier, with 77% of the responses being correct, that price range is about $2,500 to $3,500 per kilowatt. That would be what the typical cost is. Obviously, there are elements that can cause prices to go up depending on any special engineering that would be required to put solar on your property. If it isn't just a simple roof mount, it may cause the cost to be a little higher. But if you're getting a quote that's well outside that range, you need to be questioning whether you need to be looking at other bids, which is one of the suggestions that we strongly urge, is that when you're making an investment of several tens of thousands of dollars, like a vehicle or like anything else that you'd be shopping for, having multiple bids is always a good idea. And as I said before, there's quite a few really good, reputable solar firms in the community that can provide you a bid, and you can kind of compare and see what's going to work best for you. All right. Are you going to take over the questions, Jennifer? I'm going to turn over the presentation now to Jennifer, who's going to continue on with our poll questions.
All right, so we're going to move on to the next question. Okay, the typical annual energy production per kilowatt of south-facing unshaded solar is what? So this was covered earlier. So we still have a few coming in. Okay, so it is 1,400 to 1,500 kilowatt hours per year. And this is something that a person can use when they are trying to decide what the right size system is for their home. Okay, on to the next question. All solar systems can be used as backup generation when the power goes out. So meaning if there is a power outage of any kind, whether it's storm related or whatever the case may be, can you use your solar system? So far it looks like most are saying false, and that is correct. The only time it would be true would be if a customer had installed battery storage as well when they put their solar system in. Moving on. What is LES's residential rate per kilowatt hour? We haven't specifically gone over this. It's sort of a trick question, I guess you could say, because there actually is more than one answer. So the answer is we do have two residential rates. There's a summer rate and a winter rate. The summer rate is 4 months long, and that is the 0.0547. And then the winter rate is 8 months, and that's the 0.0710. So when we're talking to customers, for easy math, what we do is we just give them the average residential rate, which is about 6 cents per kilowatt hour. And this is something that we use often when we're talking about solar and what you will offset and then what overproduction would be. So when a customer is offsetting their energy use, it's 1-to-1. It's going to be, again, for easy math, it's going to be at 6 cents per kilowatt hour. But if they are overproducing, that's only going to be at half residential rate, so it'll be at 3 cents per kilowatt hour. Okay. On to the next question. Before installing solar, your home should be well insulated. True or false? The answer on this is true, and it's kind of for obvious reasons. If you make sure that your home is sealed up and you're not getting a lot of air coming in from the outside, there's potential that you could install a smaller solar system to offset your energy use, and that right there is going to be a major savings when it comes to installing solar. Okay, so I think I have one more question here. Solar Trade Ally Network participants are endorsed by LES. Yes, or true or false? Okay, so the answer is false. Inclusion on the participant list does not constitute endorsement. It only means that the solar installers have formally acknowledged that they will represent LES's rates, incentives, and anything that's utility related accurately. Okay, Mark, I believe you have the next question.
All right, we got one more question here for you. And this is a question that I think is just really important to underscore. True or false, customers who have rooftop solar no longer receive an LES bill. Is that a true or false statement? And as the results come in, we have 100% correct on this question, which is great to see. The answer is false. No matter how much energy or how little energy a solar system produces in a billing period, every customer who is connected to the grid, who's connected to LES, will receive a bill. That bill will be a customer and facility charge. What we often forget is that LES needs to have the capacity to serve every customer 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, to provide you with the energy you expect when the sun isn't shining, when the solar system may not be working. So LES has to provide that from all the way from the generator, the capacity in the transmission lines, to the substation, to the distribution grid, to the distribution transformer, and the service transformer at your home. We must have those assets ready to serve each one of your homes and businesses. And that is the cost that is captured primarily through that customer and facility charge. And so it's important to realize that, because we have seen, we've had customers call in after they put solar on their homes and they asked why they had received an electric bill. And they had been told by the solar company that put in their solar they wouldn't receive an electric bill anymore. And that's not true. And I've just described why that is. So at the very least, your energy bill would be reduced by up to all of the energy component that we talked about earlier, but the customer and facility charge would continue to be assessed so that we're collecting enough revenue to provide you with the reliable service that you count on from LES. So that's an important one to remember. With that, I'm going to turn things back over to Jennifer, and she's going to talk to you a little bit about all the tools and resources that we have available to you to help you when you're looking at purchasing a solar system.
Okay, so I am going to talk about some of the tools and resources that LES has put together for our customers when they are researching solar to determine if solar is something that works for them on their property. So the first thing, oh, could you back up one? Sorry. So the first thing here, we did create a Solar Trade Allied network. We haven't talked about it a lot in this presentation, but we created a Solar Trade Allied network participant group. What that consists of is solar installers that have gone through an orientation and then also signed this acknowledgement form here stating that they're going to represent rates, incentives, and anything utility related accurately. So I'm going to go over a couple pieces of that, and at the end, if anybody has any questions, we can address those. The one thing I do want to make clear of is even though a installer goes through the orientation and they sign this acknowledgement, it doesn't automatically mean that they will be part of the participant list. If for whatever reason we have seen that past practices have showed any kind of deceptive sales or anything like that, or not accurately representing LES, they would not be able to be on that list, and or if they had been on the list, they would be removed. So I'm just going to go over a couple bullets on here. An application for review of interconnection must be approved by LES and system must be installed by a network participant to qualify for an LES capacity incentive. So as Mark stated earlier in the presentation, the average system size that was installed was 8 kilowatts last year. And if that was an 8 kilowatt system facing south, our incentives are based on size and direction. That would be a $3,000 incentive that LES would provide to the customer. That's a check that's cut directly from LES to the customer. If they choose to use a solar installer that is not on the participant list, they would not be able to receive that capacity payment. So that's a pretty big incentive for the customer. Network participants are required to release customers from contractual obligations upon request without penalty any time prior to the utility's approval of the application for review. When a installer sends LES the application, we go ahead and review it on our side, but in the meantime, before it's approved, the approval of the application, we send the customer a thank you email along with the buyer's checklist that we will cover here in a bit, so that they can look at different things on their property to make sure that solar makes sense for them. So during that time, if for whatever the reason a customer realizes that something doesn't quite work right for their location as far as solar goes, they are not, they would not have any kind of a financial obligation to the installer until the application is approved. Falsifying information will result in a claim by LES for the return of the capacity payment and loss of designation as a network participant. We talked about that a little bit earlier. Under the acknowledgement section on this page, I acknowledge that initial operation of the net meter system will not occur until LES has installed the bidirectional meter. So a couple things on this. It's important not to operate the system until the bidirectional meter is installed for safety purposes, but also if a customer or the installer was to operate that system before the bidirectional meter was installed, the bill will actually increase rather than decrease like the customer would hope for. And then they're going to want to know why their bill went up. And then the one thing that we've been trying to cover and make very clear is that installers and sales need to make sure that they are representing current and future rates accurately. So once they've signed off on this and taken the orientation, everything is passed, and they would end up being on the Solar Trade Ally list. Next. Okay. Here is the Solar Trade Ally participant list as it sets today. There is currently 10 installers that are part of our Solar Trade Ally network participant list. And it states right on the top some of the things that we already talked about. They have formally acknowledged that they will represent the rates, the incentives, and anything utility related accurately. And the Solar Trade Ally network participants list does not constitute any sort of an endorsement by LES. So it's very important that that is communicated. The next slide shows the buyer's checklist that we've been talking about. So there's just some bullets on here that we want customers to look at and make sure they're considering before installing solar. And just understand what their bill's going to look like once they do install solar. So I'm just going to go over a few of those real brief. Ensure that your home's business is operating at maximum energy efficiency. We talked about that earlier, making sure that your home is sealed up the best of your ability by insulating, making sure that windows are tight. That will help you right size your system and possibly even decrease the size of system that you're installing. One of the bigger things is making sure that it's not shaded. If you're putting solar panels on a home that has a lot of tree coverage, you're not going to get the production that you were hoping for, and we have seen that. So it's important to make sure that you're installing solar on a roof that's not shaded. And then inspect the roof itself. If the roof is not very sound, putting a solar system on it, the weight on it, putting more holes in the roof, it's just going to lead you down down a road with some additional costs that you weren't hoping for. Understanding the rates, and then as we talked about in the quiz, on here it does state that 1 kilowatt of optimal oriented and tilted solar, southernly facing, unshaded, should produce 14 to 1500 kilowatt hours annually. So it's just some kind of high level things to just make sure that customers are considering. The one thing I really want to cover that's would be on the second page, which would be on the actual back page of the flyer, is for the customers to understand what their bill looks like and what portions of their bill it's going to be affecting. So as stated earlier, what Mark was talking about, the energy charge is what the solar system itself is going to be offsetting. So that line item is the kilowatt hours that is delivered from LES to the customers. The other portion of the bill that could potentially be a major savings is once you start offsetting that energy charge line item, You could be changing the facilities charge, and the facilities charge is a fixed cost along with the other line items on the bill. But there's three facilities charge. It's a level 1, 2, and a 3, 3 being the highest. People that have all electric homes are typically would probably be more around the level 3, or people that are high energy users. If you were to offset enough energy use to move from a level 3 to a level 2, that would be an automatic $204 decrease in savings on your electric bill each year. And that would be the same if you went from a level 2 to a level 1, it would be a savings of $114 a year. Moving down the list, review your annual electric energy history before deciding what size system you should be installing on your home. If you don't keep records on your LES bills or your energy use, you can always contact LES. We can put together past history use up to 5 years pretty quick so that you can have that in hand when you're trying to figure out what is the right size system for you. You can, if you're designing it yourself, or if you're going to be working with a solar installer, they would probably appreciate to have that information as well. Get multiple bids. Mark talked about that. It's a big investment. It's really important to understand what that's going to be. And then when reviewing the proposals that you do get with those multiple bids, make sure that you're getting the most current energy rate on there. And if you're not sure of that, again, contact LES. But the big one on the back side of this page in the gray area at the bottom, only sign a contract if you understand and you're comfortable with what's being presented to you in the terms and conditions. If something feels like it's being pushy, it doesn't feel right, don't sign anything. Give us a call and we can help you out with what the next best practices would be for that. All right. So the next slide is a free tool. One moment. Oh, here we go. So the next slide is a free tool for anybody. You just go to pvwatts.nrel.gov, and this is a very intuitive, simple tool that you can use when designing a solar system, or if you're just curious what solar would do on the property that you're thinking about installing solar on. So you type in the address of the location that you're wanting to put the solar on, and it's very intuitive. Like I said, there's just a lot of buttons that say next, but what it does is once you type in the address, it automatically figures out how much solar would be produced in that location. So based on the address, the size that you put in, and the direction that you're telling the system that you want it to be built, it will give you the annual output of that system, as well as a breakdown by month of what that system should be producing. So another thing that you could use this tool for is if you already have a system on your property and you're wanting to know if it is producing correctly, or even if you're thinking that maybe it doesn't have enough output, you could go to this tool to see what it would suggest as the output for that same size system and direction. So I think now we can open it up for discussion.
Thank you, Mark and Jennifer. That was definitely very informative. We do have quite a few questions in the chat, so I'll just sort of go through them in the order that they came in. The first one is, will the LES meter collect the amount of electricity that my solar array generates in total?
Yeah, so the meter that LES would set would not register the production of the solar array, but would rather record the net consumption. So what you want to do is, if you want to know what the solar array is generating every day, is to have a dedicated meter that you can have perhaps your solar installer put in at the time of the installation, and it would register everything being produced. Sometimes the inverter you get can be internet connected, and that data can be digitally recorded so that you have real-time or near real-time tracking of energy produced in a given hour, day, week, or even lifetime. But just know that the meter that we're placing is only going to record the energy being sent to LES when there's net production. That means that there's production that's being used by the home that we're not necessarily capturing. We're only capturing the excess production of your solar array.
So does the customer receive a check for the excess that was purchased by LES, or does that become a credit on their account?
Great question. Each month we true up and provide a credit, except for 1 month at the end of the year, at the end of the calendar year. If for some reason over the course of the entire 12-month calendar year, a customer has produced more energy than they consumed, then a check is cut to the customer, and that's according to state law, and we would send a check to that customer and we would then reset for the next calendar year.
Do you anticipate the cost of solar installation to go down as more competition is introduced into the market?
Well, you've got countervailing forces, because certainly as you get more competition, typically you would see some movement downwards in pricing. However, like all other industries, supply chain interruptions have had an impact on the solar industry. There are a number of components that are imported from other countries, and I would imagine that that has had an inflationary impact. So it really depends. If you're talking long term, I do expect maybe some decrease in cost. We've seen a tremendous decrease in cost over the last decade, just in terms of a variety of factors, including the improvement of manufacturing processes. Certainly the federal tax credit has helped to ramp up production of components. The overall efficiencies of the solar arrays have gotten better, where you can now get 350 or 400 watt arrays, when not long ago it was 150 or 200 watts per solar cell. So the efficiencies are going up, the costs have come down. But in terms of in the short term, I really can't tell if we're going to see a net increase or decrease in cost.
Okay. Has the following scenario been factored into a customer's cost savings? So rooftop solar energy generated on a southern roof versus large trees that would shade the home for a reduction in cooling costs?
No, if I understood the question, you're saying, or the customer's asking, well, I'm going to get shade if I have trees around my home, and to a certain degree, that's correct. But if you're talking about whether the effects of cooling the home from shading from a tree overcome the reduction in the amount of energy a solar array is going to produce, I don't see how that would be a wise decision. I think if you're going to put solar on your home, you want it to be unshaded and unobstructed to ideally the southerly skies if possible.
Can the list of current providers on the Solar Trade Network be found on the LES website anywhere?
So something that I forgot to mention is all the documents that I went over in this presentation can be found at les.com/solar. So the answer is yes.
And we can include that link in the chat box. If anyone wants to reference it later, you can just use that link. This one is a two-part question. So are there any data on how installing solar panels affects the resale value of homes in the Lincoln housing market? And if so, where can we find that information?
No, I have not seen anything in particular, not only for local but also national, as to whether the inclusion of solar impacts the appraisal value or the market value of a home. There's a variety of things that go into that, so I wouldn't venture to guess what impact, if any, it has on the resale value of a home.
And then the second part is, I read that on the U.S. Department of Energy site that installing a net metered systems may require additional costs from power providers in the form of inspections, additional equipment, and or insurance for having your home solar system connected to the grid. Does this apply to LES net metered systems? And if so, how?
Well, there's several questions in that question. There is no extra cost, nor does state law allow a utility to levy extra costs for a net metered system. So we would roll out a crew to put, or a technician to put in the net meter and replace the existing meter with the net meter. There's no extra cost for that. There is an electrical inspection or two required by the city, as there would be for anything that impacts electrical. There's a building and safety inspection. There are some charges for that. But then you brought up, or the question brought up, insurance. Well, certainly that's something a customer would want to visit with their home insurance provider about, in terms of including a rider for solar system. And there could be some extra costs for that. And then one thing is, we're talking about costs. Usually solar systems are warranted for 20 or 25 years, maybe a little more than that. But the inverter, that other component of the system which converts the DC to AC, the life cycle on those may be a little bit shorter. It could be 15 or 20 years. So when you're talking to a solar installer, you might ask about the warranties. And it's possible in the life of the solar that you may have to replace the inverter at least once. So that might be something, if you're doing a life cycle costing analysis, to include, is the replacement of an inverter.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit more about we've recently been hearing locally how there are some deceptive companies that claim to be endorsed by LES that are installing solar panels or reaching out to customers. Do you have any tips on what customers can do to verify the validity of these companies, or things to watch out for so that they're not deceived?
Well, by participating in today's presentation, you probably have a lot more information to be armed with than a lot of folks. I will say that personally, I'm comfortable buying Girl Scout cookies from a door-to-door salesperson. I'm not so much going to invest $20,000 or $30,000 in a solar system from a door-to-door salesperson. I guess that it's possible that a reputable dealer would sell in that manner, but if you do get a door-to-door salesperson, that might be a little bit of a red flag. Some of the tips that we've included, they're all on that checklist. Boy, I'd have that checklist handy. And I would ask to make sure that they go through that checklist with you and ask them, what electric energy rate are you using? What rate of escalation are you using? What is the production value that you're using? And then I would get a hold of LES and validate all of the assumptions that they're including, so that we can say, yep, that is reasonable, or no, that's not reasonable. I want you to leave this presentation, if nothing else, with the notion that we're here for you, and you really should start with LES. If you have any questions about this, because we will take the time to provide you with the factual information you need. We'll provide you with your energy history. We'll provide you with the tools you need to make these decisions. Jennifer, do you want to add anything else?
I think you pretty much covered it all. That checklist is really important, though. Start with LES and give us a call.
So are the listed providers on the Ally Trade Network, have they been vetted at all, or can the consumer assume that if they're part of that they're trusted and they won't run into any issues?
Well, as Jennifer's mentioned, what that means is, if these solar trade allies that are on that list, they have acknowledged in writing that they will represent LES rates, incentives, and other utility information in a factual and accurate manner. And that they also attended an orientation in which we extensively went through the whole process of solar interconnection. That is the extent to which these firms have been vetted. We are not getting into the Better Business Bureau business. So it's always wise to look at various sources. If makes you feel more comfortable, talk to references that solar firm may have. So you may want to get 3, 4, 5 addresses of homes and names and numbers of individuals to find out what their experience was. Drive by the home, see if they're facing the right direction. You can do your due diligence, and it doesn't have to be very time consuming. But again, when you're making this type of investment, you want to make sure that you're having all good information you can get.
Perfect. Well, Mark, Jennifer, thank you. Those are all the questions that we have right now. This webinar was recorded, so if you joined late, you can visit les.com. You can catch a recording of it early next week. It'll also have all of the resources that were mentioned in the PowerPoint. And if you do have any questions, we'll link to where you can direct those on our website. So again, thank you, Jennifer, Mark, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.